Okay, hello everyone. This is Colin Cox, and this is the Week 1 lecture for Modern American Literature. In this lecture, I want to discuss primarily Walt Whitman's poem Song of Myself. And I know there's some other reading that I asked you to do, but I won't necessarily address those two poems. Another one I believe is a Walt Whitman poem. In this lecture, I want to focus all of our attention on Song of Myself, and this won't be a comprehensive conversation or analysis about the poem. I will certainly read from the poem, so I would encourage you to have your textbook out, but I want to highlight some important themes and ideas from the poem, and I also want to just speak about or identify perhaps some questions you may want to think about when reading and reviewing and potentially using this poem for a written assignment, whether it's a short response or an essay. But I think I'll start. If you go to the additional information module in the content tab, you'll notice that I've provided some visual information about the different editions of Song of Myself, because Whitman edited this larger collection of poems called Leaves of Grass. Song of Myself appears in Leaves of Grass, but he edited it multiple times in his life, and this is an important idea or an important concept I would encourage you to embrace. Walt Whitman as a poet and Song of Myself and Leaves of Grass, they're all extremely canonical, which is to say, Walt Whitman is the kind of poet that people really like to read and really like to teach. He's important. Song of Myself is an important poem. Leaves of Grass is an important book. They have this significant status in what's called the American literary canon. And we often think of those kinds of figures, and especially those kinds of texts, as extremely stable, right? Which means we have this concept or this idea of the text itself, in this case, Song of Myself, and in particular, the writers and the poets that produce them, as possessing something that is difficult to identify, but it's something that, I don't know, the rest of us just don't have, right? It's this misconception, I would argue at least, this misconception about what the writer and the poet is, that they're in possession of something special, something transcendent that allows them to create these magnificent works of art. And what I think we see by just realizing and acknowledging that Song of Myself endured or experienced these different revisions over Whitman's life is, well, what we ultimately think of as Song of Myself, the way we're reading it in this anthology. This was part of a process. This was part of a long process. And this is something you could certainly write about, but take a few minutes and look at the different editions of Song of Myself and just pay attention to the significance of the changes, because I think one of the questions you might want to ask yourself when thinking about this poem is, what is the idea Whitman wants to communicate to his reader, and what is the question or the set of questions he wants to explore, he's trying to interrogate and ultimately answer? And how do the different editions of this poem potentially allow him to better address those concerns or answer those questions? So I'll leave it to you to look at those different editions and to think about them. But the important thing, the takeaway, I suppose, is as it appears in this anthology, this textbook that I want you to read, Song of Myself, that's not how it first appeared when Whitman published it back in 1855. It took him nearly 40 years to get this poem to the point where I suppose you could say he was satisfied. And maybe if he lived longer, he would just continue to edit it, right? You could imagine that happening. But the point is, this process is important. And seeing the different iterations of the poem over Whitman's life might give us a better sense of how his thoughts and feelings about the poem itself evolved and what that evolution meant for him. But let's take a step back and say something about Walt Whitman. So, Walt Whitman is one of those names in American literature that a lot of people know, a lot of students of literature, but even just casual readers, because Walt Whitman is, for many, the great American poet. He addresses, in all of his poetry and his writing, a myriad of different themes and ideas. But I think what you see in Leaves of Grass and in this poem as well, Song of Myself. Again, remember, Leaves of Grass is the book or the larger collection of poems. Song of Myself appears in that collection. But he addresses a collection or a handful of different themes and ideas that, while not unique to America, they are the sorts of concerns that seem to arise from one generation to the next in this country. Questions, for example, of inclusivity. What does it mean to create a society and a country that affords certain individuals certain privileges and by doing that excludes other individuals? And because of that, this notion of acceptance is extremely important as well. What does it mean to create an inclusive, accepting society? But you also see Whitman grappling with very physical and tangible ideas and notions. You'll notice the body, the physical body, and the celebration of the physical body appears quite often in Song of Myself. Whitman is someone who, and it should be quite clear after reading this poem, finds the human body and the human form quite beautiful, even in its perhaps what we would call imperfections. I think for someone like Whitman, there's something so beautiful and sublime about the human body. Even a stomach that is a bit paunchy, for him, it's still all beautiful because the human body is a beautiful thing. The form itself, the form in nature in particular, is so beautiful for him. He's also interested in questions of materiality and spirituality because we often separate the two. For example, we have this very crude material world that we all occupy, but for many, we reserve this special privilege for the spiritual realm. And we often, and this is something you might hear, for example, in Christianity, this idea, once we die, we leave our physical form behind and we transcend with the spiritual. So there is this kind of separation. And because of that, there is this prioritizing of the spiritual over the material. But what you find with someone like Whitman is a combination of the two. He wants to think of the spiritual and the material together. And I mentioned nature before. One of the more delightful characteristics of Song of Myself are the rhapsodic descriptions of nature that Whitman gives us. He is someone who was heavily influenced by transcendentalism, and that's a philosophy that was popular in the mid-19th century with American authors and writers such as Emerson and Thoreau. But what you see, and in particular, if you know someone like Henry David Thoreau, who wrote the book Walden, this book about this rather naive attempt to retreat into nature, and by doing so, finding a kind of serenity, something quite special in the sublimity of nature. Whitman is clearly influenced heavily by those ideas, but I might spend a few minutes discussing how he departs from, or perhaps nuances, some of the ideas of transcendentalism, but maybe that's more of a secondary concern here. He's also someone who is clearly quite interested, especially when you think about the sorts of characters he describes and sketches in Song of Myself. He's quite interested in forms of prejudice, both class and racial prejudice. He's someone, again, who seems to want to develop an image or a picture of a world and a country and a nation. And here he is writing about the United States that is as inclusive as it can be, that tries to transcend perhaps the pettiness of class and racial division. And all of this, I would argue, is informed by, quite frankly, the newness of America. This is something, especially for us in the 21st century, which is perhaps difficult at times to conceptualize because America feels like such an established place. But if you are Walt Whitman in the mid 19th century, America has not been America for that long. And considering what happens just a decade later after he wrote and published the first edition of Song of Myself, the American Civil War, well, less than a decade, it ended a decade after he wrote and published the first edition of Song of Myself, there is this sense that America may not continue as a nation, as an experiment, and that's those political considerations are very much a part of what Whitman was clearly thinking about. This is something you see in his essays, in his letters, that the cloud of this civil war that for him at the time will come, and obviously did come, it's something. It's an idea that heavily influenced some of the more overt political aspects of this poem, but also self-reliance. And this is something you see with those transcendentalist writers as well, relying on oneself, seeing oneself certainly as part of a collective, but not allowing the influence of the collective to infringe upon your individual rights. And I think this is the place where Whitman departs from those transcendentalist writers like Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, because, and this is one of the points I want to make about Song of Myself, I think for a figure like Whitman, you don't get to a sense of yourself as an individual by fleeing from collectivity, which is to say, fleeing from a community or a collective effort. I think for someone like Whitman, you only really find yourself as an individual by going through the collective or by fully embracing a collective project. And it's only by doing that, once you arrive at the other end, can you then see or understand yourself in an individual sense, or see and understand yourself as an individual. So that's something I'll certainly return to throughout this lecture. But I want to begin just with section 1, where it begins, because Whitman begins this poem by entering into two poetic traditions, the sonnet and the epic. So, but, and this is the important or the interesting thing, he departs from both of them. So I'll read from section 1. In the textbook, it begins on page 23. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume, you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul, I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. My tongue, every atom of my blood formed from this soil, this air, born here of parents, born here from parents the same, and their parents the same. I, now 37 years old, in perfect health begin, hoping to cease, not till death. And I'll stop there. So this opening line, now all of this poem, with the exception of the opening line, is in free verse. And free verse poetry, quite simply, doesn't have the sorts of rhyming and meter rules that you might find, for example, in a Shakespearean sonnet. A Shakespearean sonnet, for example, has certain expectations. So almost every line of a Shakespeare sonnet has 10 syllables. And those syllables, the way, and you wouldn't necessarily read it with this kind of emphasis, but you would not stress the first syllable, but stress the second syllable. So it's unstressed, stressed. So one of the opening lines to one of Shakespeare's sonnets sounds like this: Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? So that's one line, 10 syllables, unstressed, stressed. And that's how Whitman actually begins this poem, by entering into a tradition defined in many ways, or perfected, some might argue, by William Shakespeare. Can you think of a writer more significant in the English language than William Shakespeare? Because the opening line, if you wanted to read it with that iambic pentameter, that's what it's called, that's what this meter and rhyming pattern is called, it would sound like this: I celebrate myself and sing myself. But then notice, if you try to continue that meter pattern, it just completely dissolves in the second line. And what I assume you shall assume. It's weird. It doesn't quite work because the second line has only 9 syllables. So almost immediately, Whitman introduces, or you could argue pays homage to, this particular poetic tradition, the Shakespearean sonnet, but then he immediately departs from it. Perhaps because he wants to create something new, because again, this poem in many ways is a reflection of America, and America is this new place, but America is a place that for many, many years, for many decades and generations, felt as though it was in the shadow of the British Empire. And again, thinking of William Shakespeare as a projection of, or a symbol of, that empire is significant here. But I also mentioned there's another poetic or literary tradition that Whitman gestures toward here at the beginning, and that's the epic. So think of those grand epic poems like the Iliad or the Odyssey, because it certainly does feel like Whitman wants to take us, the reader, on something similar to those kinds of grand adventures. However, if you read a poem like the Iliad by Homer, you know that it begins with strife. It begins the whole narrative of that poem. The drive of that narrative is one defined by strife and division. But Whitman moves in a completely different direction. He gestures more towards something collective, something unified, and you see that in the first 2 or 3 lines of the poem in this section. This feels like an embrace. He, the poet, the speaker, attempts to embrace us, the reader. There isn't this sense of division, or at least, and I think this is important, he doesn't want to sow this sort of division. He has perhaps a bigger idea, or a bigger, more collective project that he wants to develop. Maybe that's one of the questions that he wants to interrogate or answer. Can he do that? So he makes reference to, he pays homage to two important literary and poetic traditions, but he departs from them in noticeable ways. But I also want to say something here at the beginning about what Whitman, the speaker, might sound like, because it feels like maybe he's boasting a little here at the beginning. I celebrate myself and sing myself. There's something unmistakably individualistic about that opening line. You might think, my goodness, Walt Whitman, you must think a lot of yourself to celebrate yourself. But I would encourage you to pay attention to how quickly he departs from it. And he offers specific details about himself, but especially as you read through the poem, it feels less and less like a poem about him, and more a poem about all of us. In many ways, that individualism that begins this poem, it seems to retreat or dissolve. And I think that's important because what you start to see with Whitman's narrator or Whitman's speaker, it has this ability to go places that any one of us as individuals cannot go. I often describe it to my students as Whitman's cosmic eye. It's an eye, it feels individualistic, but it has this ability to leap space and time and boundaries. It can actually enter into other individuals and we can see the world from their perspective. So while it is, and this is part of the contradiction, you see contradictions appear so often in this poem. He's an individual I celebrate myself and I sing myself, but he also has these powers and this ability to just inhabit anyone and everyone. He can be anywhere he wants. And that's something, again, that as individuals, we don't often have the power to do. So there is something delightfully contradictory about it. And again, trace how often or mark how often you see contradictions in this poem because they just appear all over the place. From here, I think I want to move ahead to sections 5 and 6. And I'll read directly from section 5, and this begins on page 25. I believe in you, my soul. The other I am must not abase itself to you, and you must not be abased to the other. Loaf with me on the grass, loose to stop from your throat. Not words, not music or rhyme I want, not custom or lecture, not even the best. Only the lull I like, the hum of your valved voice. I mind how once we lay such a transparent summer morning, how you settled your head athwart my hips and gently turned over upon me, and parted the shirt from my bosom bone, and plunged your tongue to my bare, stripped heart, and reached till you felt my beard, and reached till you held my feet. Swiftly arose and spread around me the peace and knowledge that pass all the argument of the earth. And I know that the hand of God is the promise of my own, and I know that the Spirit of God is the brother of my own, and that all the men ever born are also my brothers, and the women my sisters and lovers, and that a kelson of the creation is love. And limitless are leaves, stiff or drooping in the fields, and brown ants in the little wells beneath them, and mossy scabs of the worm fence, heaped stones, elder, mullein, and pokeweed. And I'll stop there. So at the beginning of this section, and I'll read this one more time, Whitman says, I believe in you, my soul. The other I am must not abase itself to you, and you must not be abased to the other. So Whitman here, he's offering, and then he describes himself, his body, having this potentially erotic experience with his soul. And this is important. And it's important because Whitman, and I mentioned this a moment ago, instead of elevating the soul, because we have this way of separating body and soul often. Again, think about if you've ever heard or if you're familiar with some expressions of Christianity. Once your body dies, once you shift off these mortal coils, your soul will transcend, right? It's this special thing inside of you, and your body is just this crude vessel for it until something better comes. But that doesn't seem to be how Whitman wants us to think about it, because instead of elevating the soul, he grounds the soul, or the infinite, with the material, which is the finite, because all of this, all of us, again, our bodies are finite. But notice what Whitman wants to do. Again, this kind of contradiction. He wants to blend or combine or marry the infinite with the finite. And notice, and I think this is important, for him, it's not this idea, or it's not this sense that it's abasement for either the body or the soul to do this. In fact, this is perhaps the natural thing. It seems as if Whitman sees or thinks of this way that we separate body and soul as terribly unnatural, and he wants to perhaps fight against that unnatural current. So this blending of the infinite with the finite, here specifically the soul and the body, seems incredibly important. But section 6, because to this point, the poem feels, I would argue, not incoherent, but it's lacking perhaps any clear or direct focus. But in section 6, Whitman gives us a bit of focus. And notice how that focus arrives in the form of a question. A child said, "What is the grass?" fetching it to me with full hands. How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he. I guess it must be the flag of my disposition, out of hopeful green stuff woven. Or I guess it is the handkerchief of the Lord, a scented gift and remembrancer, designedly dropped, bearing the owner's name some way in the corners, that we may see and remark and say, whose? Or I guess the grass is itself a child, and I won't continue because Whitman basically just continues because he doesn't really have a good answer to this question. In the end, though, in section 52, it arrives, or Whitman returns to this question, because he sees the grass ultimately as a reminder perhaps that nothing ends. And this is, again, Whitman at his most optimistic. And I would encourage you just to pay attention to, or mark, just how optimistic this poem is at times. I mentioned earlier that Whitman first wrote and published Leaves of Grass while the United States was on the doorstep of civil war. A civil war that, for us in the 21st century, seems to have had only one possible conclusion, right? The South loses, the North wins, the United States is reunified. But that only seems self-evident to us because it's the past. For someone writing in 1855, that would not have seemed so self-evident. The idea of this extremely young country dividing, experiencing a civil war, and then not reunifying was a very real proposition. So even in the face of all of that civil unrest, Whitman has the ability to find so much optimism and so much promise. And that's one of the many things that I like about Walt Whitman, especially when, and I don't think you need to do this, I hesitate to do this, placing a poem like this in a particular historical context, because I think the optimism is just quite clear. Whether you even knew that the first edition was written in 1855, I think it's just so clear that this is an optimistic poem. But I want to bounce around a bit, talk about some other sections. You'll notice again with section 10, these wonderful, rich, detailed descriptions of these characters that feel uniquely American. For example, on page 29, the Yankee clipper is under her sky sails. She cuts the sparkle and scud. My eyes settle the land. I bend at her prow, or shout joyously from the deck. The boatmen and clam diggers arose early and stopped for me. I tucked my trouser ends in my boots and went and had a good time. Whitman's always having a good time. You should have been with us that day round the chowder kettle. So we see again some of Whitman's inclusivity here. He really, and I think you also see this in the shorter poem that I asked you to read, the sorts of characters that populate Whitman's poetry. They're often, especially for the time, not the sorts of characters that populated literature or that is another way of saying Whitman doesn't seem interested or terribly enthusiastic about writing about kings and queens, princes and princesses. He wants to write about boatmen and clam diggers, and we see these sorts of what we would perhaps today call working class characters. They feature quite heavily in Whitman's poetry, especially Song of Myself, and even slaves, people of color. They also have room and space, as they should, in Whitman's poetry. And of course, I modify that by suggesting as they should. But in 1855, regrettably for many Americans, they would not just say, well, yes, of course they have a place. But for Whitman, they have a natural place. It would be unnatural to exclude them. In section 17, Whitman returns to that blade of grass again, this question that in many ways haunts the lines of his poetry. Quote, and this is on page 34, "There are really the thoughts of all men in all ages and lands. They are not original with me. If they are not yours as much as mine, they are nothing or next to nothing. If they are not the riddle and the untying of the riddle, they are nothing. If they are not just as close as they are distant, they are nothing. This is the grass that grows wherever the land is and the water is. This is the common air that bathes the globe." So again, this question, this notion of a blade of grass, what is this? It is an idea that Whitman, again, he doesn't quite have a good answer at the beginning, and he's perhaps getting closer to an answer here, but don't be surprised if that blade of grass just inserts itself, again, as if it has its own agency at times throughout this poem. Now, I spoke about how often Whitman likes to consider paradoxical or contradictory ideas, but he also communicates this to us, and this is a technique of his, just on a figurative and metaphoric basis. It's not just about philosophical musings. We just see it with some of the images that he produces, at times from one line to the next. Look, for example, at the beginning of section 16. I'm still on page 34. "I am of old and young, of the foolish as much as the wise, regardless of other, ever regardful of others." Just notice the paradoxes here. He's young and old, he's foolish and wise, regardless and regardful. Whitman seems quite interested in rejecting these simple categories that are free of confusion, contradiction, inconsistencies. For Whitman, it seems in many ways, both just at times from one line to the next, but as a larger poetic, literary, and philosophical project, the contradiction is so important, or the contradiction is the thing we should embrace. Now, I do want to jump back. I realized I've forgotten to say something about section 11, which is one of the most celebrated but also confusing sections in the poem, and I'll just read it. Section 11's on page 29. 28 young men bathe by the shore, 28 young men, and all so friendly, 28 years of womanly life, and all so lonesome. She owns the fine house by the rise of the bank. She hides, handsome and richly dressed, aft the blinds of the window. Which of the young men does she like the best? Ah, the homeliest of them is beautiful to her. Where are you off to, lady? For I see you. You splash in the water there, yet stay stock still in your room. Dancing and laughing along the beach came the 29th bather. The rest did not see her, but she saw them and loved them. The beards of the young men glistened with wet. It ran from their long hair. Little streams passed over their bodies. An unseen hand also passed over their bodies. It descended tremblingly from their temples and ribs. The young men float on their backs, their white bellies bulged to the sun. They do not ask who sees as fast to them. They do not know who puffs and declines with pendant and bending arch. They do not think whom they souse with spray. And I'll let you read that sousing with spray however you like. But this is a provocative and, if you don't mind, a rather sexually charged section of the poem where Whitman sees, again, notice this eye of his. It sees this shy, demure woman watching these men bathing, and she's watching longingly. But I think perhaps what's important here, this is a section of imagination. And notice how Whitman's imagination allows him to explore certain ideas and concepts. Again, we see how important nature and the human body features in this section. There's something so elevated, and there's something so sublime about this image of these young men just casually bathing on a warm afternoon or whatever. And I think for someone like Whitman, this is the perfect expression of what humanity and nature can look like. It's just so sublime. And it's also, to some sense, incomplete, because there is this sense of voyeurism, which is to say, there's someone watching this, watching perhaps in a way that she shouldn't. It's as if she's stealing this scene, or she's seeing something that maybe she shouldn't. And it's as if this scene or this sequence invites her into it. So while unto itself it seems whole and complete, there's also someone or something excluded. But my goodness, notice how this moment or this sequence so desperately tries to invite this person into it. But you'll also notice, again, the way Whitman deploys contradiction and paradox as a way of perhaps describing how this woman feels while watching this scene. Where are you off to, lady? For I see you. You splash in the water there, yet stay stock still in your room. Her imagination has perhaps taken her there, but she remains immobile in some way. So I'll leave it to you again to continue to think through the significance of this section. But because of time constraints, I think I just want to move to the end of the poem. Again, I know I'm offering something of a quick reading of this poem, and there's a lot to be said that I haven't said. And I'll just read the final section, section 52. This is on page 66. The spotted hawk swoops by and accuses me. He complains of my gab and my loitering. This is fun, right? This is a way of perhaps suggesting Whitman's just been talking or writing too long. He needs to get on with it. He needs to finish. I too am not a bit tamed. I too am untranslatable. I sound my barbaric yawp over the roofs of the world. The last scud of day holds back for me. It flings my likeness after the rest, and true as any of the shadowed wilds, it coaxes me to the vapor and the dusk. I depart as air. I shake my white locks at the runaway sun. I effuse my flesh in eddies and drifted in lacy jags. I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles. You will hardly know who I am or what I mean, but I shall be good health to you, nevertheless, and filter and fiber your blood. Failing to fetch me at first, keep encouraged. Missing me one place, search another. I stop somewhere, waiting for you. Once again, These lines remind the reader of several important ideas Whitman develops throughout this poem: the body, nature, community, and growth. In addition, he returns to the question that provoked much of this poem, and the answer is far simpler than it might seem. What is this blade of grass? The child asks in section 6. Well, for Whitman here at the end, the best answer he has is, it's me, or it's you, or it's all of us. It's this reflection of this process that refurbishes this world that we occupy. It's not a single individual thing. Perhaps the flaw with the question is the singularity of the blade. The blade of grass is not a blade of grass. It's part of a larger body of grass, or a larger body of people. It's perhaps wrong to reduce it to this single element. And while all of this sounds nice, you might also think, but this all sounds so simple. But that's part of what I like about Whitman. There is a lot of complexity in this poem, but at times there's also a lot of simplicity. And while Whitman might sound like a hippie, and he probably was, it's also important to acknowledge that whatever image you have in your imagination of Whitman, you're not necessarily wrong, but so much of what followed in Whitman's wake may have diluted some of the more philosophically rich points I've tried to make in this lecture. His thoughts about the body and the soul, the material and the immaterial, what it means to be an individual. How does one find oneself? Well, again, I think for Whitman, and I think the poem, again, demonstrates this. It's an exercise in showing this. It's not by rejecting the collective, which so many transcendentalist writers, that's at times maybe an unfair way to characterize them, but there's a bit of truth in it. Again, for Whitman, it's not about rejecting or retreating from the collective. You only start to see and understand yourself as an individual by fully embracing the power of the collective. And that's also, regrettably, an idea that I would argue many Americans have difficulty embracing, because we are very much a country that celebrates the individual. And it's not that we shouldn't celebrate the individual. We should. But I think what Whitman asks us to consider, and what Whitman asks us to ultimately think about is, well, how do you ultimately get to the point where you can understand yourself as an individual? And again, for Whitman, it's not by rejecting the collective. It's by fully embracing it and really traveling through it. Because notice, the poem begins with the word I, but it ends with the word you. And I think for Whitman, even though that's second person, it's more of a collective you, all of us. Okay, I think that's all I want to say for now, because this lecture is getting a bit longer than I want it to be. But if you have any questions or additional ideas about Whitman's Song of Myself, I would love to hear them. And later this week, this wasn't on the syllabus, but I'll post a video to Yuja, probably on Friday or Saturday, just explaining what I want to see from those short weekly responses. I would encourage you to read the prompt. If you have any questions for now, just save them until you watch that video, and hopefully that video will address some of your questions. But if it doesn't, if you have additional questions, just please contact me. Okay, I hope you have a good day and a good week. And if you're outside, please tell me if you find Walt Whitman on the bottom of your shoes. I'd love to hear about it. Okay, have a good week, and I'll talk to you next week.